Hey there and welcome to BYJU'S 6th, 7th and 8th grade channel. I'm your teacher Aishwarya and I welcome you to this video where we are going to be discussing the chapter Transportation in Plants and Animals, and we will be revising the entire chapter in just under 30 minutes. Now, of course, if you are looking for an in-depth chapter explanation, in the description of this video, you will be able to find the link for the one shot of this chapter where I have gone into the depths of the concept. But please mind you students, today we will be just revising the chapter in under 30 minutes. So I would recommend that you have your NCERT textbook open with you, have your notes ready, because I will be giving you some important questions and topics that you should highlight and keep a note of when especially your exams are right around the corner. So without wasting any more time, we will get started. Now, this particular chapter deals with some important concepts such as circulation of blood within the body, deals with excretion in our body, then of course deals with transport of water and food items in plants. So these are the three broad topics that we will be covering in this video. Now, let me also tell you one very important thing. By the end of this class, you will also have access to a Google form that is available in the description. There you have some interesting questions that you can solve side by side so that you will get to know how much you have revised by the end of it. So I hope that all of you are excited and we will get started with today's video. Now, as you can see, the first topic that we are going to be covering is circulation of blood in humans. Now, when we talk about circulation, there is a concept that we must address first, and that is transportation. Now, if I were to ask you what is transportation, you would tell me, ma'am, it is moving things from one place to another. Now, what do we mean by transportation in animals? What is the need to transport things? And if at all there is a need, what are we transporting? Now, from our previous chapters, we know that there is the need to transport digested nutrients, right? So, there is a need to transport digested nutrients to different parts of the body. Then, of course, from the chapter respiration, we know that there is a need to transport oxygen that enters when we breathe in air, right? So, air rich in oxygen enters into our body, and this oxygen then needs to get transported to different parts in order to produce energy. Then along with that, as a byproduct, we know that carbon dioxide is released that needs to be expelled out. So all the carbon dioxide that gets produced from different parts needs to get collected and then be brought back to our respiratory system so that we can expel it out. Yes. Then along with that, there are these other substances, right? Other substances like other proteins, other hormones, so on. Other substances that need to get transported. So in all this case, who is responsible for doing this? Well, in our body, it is the circulatory system, which comprises of the blood vessels, and the heart. Now, if we were to talk about the blood, we see that blood right here is a transporting fluid. I would call it as a transporting fluid, which is actually the one which does the transporting, right? So when I say there's transport of oxygen, nutrients, carbon dioxide, it is the blood which is actually carrying out the work. But this blood is a fluid, which means that it needs to have a channel through which it has to pass. So these channels or tubes through which the blood flows through is what we call as the blood vessels. But it's not that the blood is going to move on its own, right? Somebody has to pump the blood or give that blood the push so that it continuously circulates within our body, which is where we have the pump or the heart, which acts as a pump in ensuring that the blood is constantly circulating within our body. So keeping this in mind, let's get started with the first part, which is the components of blood. Now, broadly, the components of blood can be categorized into two. We see that blood has a fluid part and it has a cellular part. Now, the fluid part of blood is what we call as plasma. Now, plasma, if you see, makes up about 55% of blood. And plasma, in turn, is mainly made up of water. And along with that, it's also made up of other salts and other substances, and they also play an important role in transport. And all the different cells that make up the blood is found in the plasma. So if you were to talk about the cellular component, we see that the cellular component includes three types of cells: RBCs, WBCs, and platelets. So first up, let's have a look at the first one, which is the red blood cells. Now the red blood cells are nothing but the RBCs. And we see that they appear to be somewhat discoid in shape, right? So they have a disc-like shape as I have roughly drawn here. Now this is what imparts the red color to the blood. because it has a pigment in it called as hemoglobin. And this right here is very, very important, students. Please highlight this. Now, hemoglobin is a pigment that imparts the red color. But apart from this, we also see that hemoglobin has a, I would say, has a high affinity towards oxygen. Now, what do I mean by this word affinity? Think of it as hemoglobin and oxygen being best friends. That every time they see each other, they have to be together. So they will always hold hands and walk around. So in this particular case, we see that when you look at it, hemoglobin has high affinity for oxygen. That means that one of the main functions of the red blood cells is transport of oxygen to different parts of the body. And who exactly is helping with this transport? It is the hemoglobin. Now, the details of how exactly this happens, I will not go into it, but it's a rough understanding that when I say red blood cells are responsible for transport, it is because of the hemoglobin that is present. Now, with this, we have understood the role of red blood cells. Now, next up, let's move to the second type, which is the white blood cells. Now, the white blood cells are also known as the WBCs. And we see that they tend to have an irregular shape, or we can say that they have an amoeboid shape. And we see that the WBCs here are mainly responsible for helping us fight against disease-causing germs or any foreign substance that may enter into the body. So they are like our soldiers who are constantly fighting and ensuring that our body is kept healthy. Last but not the least, we have our platelets. Platelets again have a very irregular shape and they play a very important role in the clotting of blood. So anytime we have an injury, whether it's an internal injury or an external injury, we see that platelets rush to the site to ensure that there is no loss of blood and its components, and they ensure that they seal the wound. Which is why after some time when we get a cut, initially we tend to lose a little bit of blood, but after some time that stops. And that stops because these platelets that are there, they act or they kind of come and they, if this is a cut, they, sort of come and clump around the wound, and then they eventually, with the help of a lot of chemical processes, they come and they form a mesh so that no longer blood can ooze out. So with this, if you see, we've had a look at the different functions of the different components of the blood. Now we know that in all cases, transport of substances is taking place. But for the blood to move around, there needs to be specific channels, which is why channels through which blood moves around is what we call as blood vessels. And we see that in the body, there are three types of blood vessels. So we see that we have arteries, there are veins, and there are capillaries. Now, the best way to understand arteries, veins, and capillaries is with respect to the heart, right? So, if this right here is the heart, so let me roughly draw a structure. So, if this were the heart, we see that heart is the pump. So, blood is constantly moving around because the heart is pumping the blood. So, we see that there are blood vessels which take the blood away from the heart, and there are some blood vessels which bring blood towards the heart. So we see that arteries can be commonly defined as blood vessels that transport blood away from the heart, right? So they transport it away from the heart. While on the other hand, veins that are there transport blood towards the heart. Yes? So they transport it or they take it to the heart. So this is an easy way to remember the difference between arteries and veins. Now, primarily, we observe that arteries are responsible for transporting oxygenated blood. That means blood which is rich in oxygen. But again, there are some exceptions, which means that there are some arteries, or there's one artery that does not follow this rule. While in the case of veins, they primarily transport deoxygenated. Now, what do I mean by deoxygenated blood? That means that this blood that goes through the veins has a lot of carbon dioxide in it. And most veins transport deoxygenated blood except for one. So these are the, I would say, simple broad differences between arteries and veins. There are further differences as well. If you look at it, because they are transporting blood away from the heart, we see that the arteries are highly muscular and they have thick walls, right? So we see that they have thick walls. While in this case, we see that veins have thin walls because they are not getting pumped. Blood through the veins is not getting pumped because they are taking it towards the heart from different organs. Only organ in our body which acts as a pump is our heart. No other organ acts as a pump. Which is why we see that walls here are thin. The force through which the blood flows is also very less, right? But we also see that there's a special structure called as valves which are present. What are valves? Think of valves as one-way doors, right? They are one-way doors which open only on one direction. If you were to come the other way, it will not open. So what is the main function of the valve? It prevents backflow of blood. Now you can pause this video right now to take a screenshot, or you can write the pointers that I have given you, because they can ask this particular question for 3 marks where they ask you to differentiate between arteries and veins. Now on the other hand, we have another structure which is called as the capillaries. Now what are capillaries? Capillaries are very thin walled blood vessels, right? So we see that they are very thin walled blood vessels. They are so thin that it is just one single cell thick. And we see that exchange of gases, right? So we know what exchange of gases are. So exchange of gases between, let's say, cells and capillaries takes place here, right? So here we see that there is exchange of gases. So in this case, we see that arteries bring the oxygen, right? So artery, let me just write that again. If these are my arteries, they are bringing the oxygen. Arteries will keep branching out, forming capillaries, where all the oxygen will go to the surrounding cells, and whatever carbon dioxide that is there produced by the cells will enter. Yes, and eventually what will happen? We see that all of them will join and they will form veins. So that is how arteries end up primarily transporting oxygenated blood, and your veins end up getting the deoxygenated blood or the carbon dioxide rich blood. But now all of this is getting pumped or moved around because of the heart. Now if you were to look at the structure of the heart, there's a very easy way to remember. Now the human heart is a 4-chambered heart. So I will draw it with the help of a schematic diagram. So we see that it is a 4-chambered heart. And we see that the 4 chambers that are there can be divided into 2. So we see that we have the upper chamber, we have the lower chambers, and we have the upper chambers, right? So there are these upper chambers and the lower chambers. Now the upper chambers are often called as the receiving chambers. That means that they will always receive blood from different parts. Yes, it could be either from the lungs or different parts of the body. While the lower chambers are always, their job is to pump, right? So I said that heart acts as a pump, which means that they are acting as a pump because of these very presence of lower chambers. So I will call it as pumping chambers. Now to give it a more technical term, we call receiving chambers as atrium or atria, while we call the pumping chambers as ventricles. Are we clear? Okay. Now we will move on to another bifurcation. The heart is also divided into as the right side and the left side. So we have the right and the left. Yes? So if you see, this is the right side and this right here is the left side. Now based on this, what can you see? The right chamber on top is a atrium, while this right here is the bottom chamber. It's a pumping chamber, so it is a ventricle. Similarly, on the left side on top, if it is on top, it is a receiving chamber. So this is the left atrium and this is the left ventricle. So this is how we have the 4 chambers of the heart. So this is an easy way to remember. Now understand that the right side of the heart will receive deoxygenated blood, right? So we see that it receives deoxygenated blood from different parts of the body. So the right atrium will receive it, and then it will pass it to the right ventricle. Now once it reaches the right ventricle, what is going to happen? The right ventricle will pump it out, because now if it is deoxygenated, it has carbon dioxide. Now where will we expel this carbon dioxide? The carbon dioxide will be expelled out through the lungs, right? So we see that from the right ventricle, it will pump it to the lungs. And we see that this right here is done by the pulmonary artery. So pulmonary artery is the only artery in our body which is responsible for carrying deoxygenated blood from heart to lungs. Now once it reaches the lungs, we know gaseous exchange happens, carbon dioxide is expelled out, oxygen is brought in. So from here what will happen? Lungs will bring in oxygen rich or oxygenated blood. So blood vessels will bring the oxygen rich blood. And here we see that this is an exception. So we have something called as the pulmonary vein, which will bring in the oxygenated blood to the left side. From here it will go to left ventricle. Left ventricle will pump it to different parts of the body. So if you look at it here, the right side always receives deoxygenated blood. Left side always receives oxygenated blood. And this is how we see that the blood is constantly getting pumped to different parts of the body. Now, if you look at it, we see that this happens because of rhythmic contractions and relaxations. Now, the heart is constantly beating, right? It is constantly beating, and we see that this is happening because of the presence of some involuntary muscles called as the cardiac muscles. And they rhythmically contract and relax. And thereby we see that it results in the formation of a heartbeat, right? So a heartbeat is formed with the help of a rhythmic contraction and relaxation. Now one more thing is that as the blood is pumped, we know that any blood vessel leaving the heart is called as an artery, right? So we also see that blood is going in that rhythmic form even through the arteries. So the throbbing nature that we see in the arteries is what we call as the pulse, right? So pulse can be defined as the rhythmic contraction and relaxation of the walls of the artery. And the number of beats or the number of pulse per minute that we calculate is what we call as the pulse rate. And for a resting individual, the pulse rate is roughly between 72 to 80 beats per minute. While similarly, if you calculate heart rate is number of heartbeats per minute. So there's not much of a difference between pulse rate, heart rate, but one thing you need to understand is how we calculate it. So with this, we've had a look at the entire concept with respect to transport or circulatory system in our body. Now along with this, the next concept that we're going to dwell with is excretion. Now what is excretion? Excretion is nothing but the removal of metabolic waste. Now what do I mean by metabolic waste? Now various chemical reactions are constantly happening within our body, which means that there's a lot of waste materials that get produced, which also need to be expelled out of our body. So the waste materials produced as a result of various chemical reactions is what we call as the metabolic waste. Now we see that this process of removal is what we call as excretion. And we again have an organ system dedicated to this, which is called as the excretory system. Now the primary organ here is the kidney, right? So if you look at it, we see that blood that has this metabolic waste enters, right? Or we see that all this is brought by the blood to the kidneys. And we have a pair of kidneys which are located in our abdominal region, and we see that they act as filters. So just like how we have a water filter that helps in purifying the water and getting rid of unwanted substances, the kidney acts as a filter. And we see that the blood carrying the waste enters into the kidneys where all the waste material is, filtered out, and we see that maybe if there's excess water and other substances, they're all filtered out. And we see that it will form something called as urine. So waste that gets dissolved in water is what we call as urine. So all the harmful substances and unwanted substances are filtered out, and all the useful substances are then sent back to the body. So we see that urine formation takes place inside the kidneys. Now this urine is then transported through these tube-like structures. So if we have a pair of kidneys, we have a pair of tube-like structures called as the ureter, which then takes it to a muscular pouch-like structure called as the bladder. So the urinary bladder is where the urine is temporarily stored for a brief period of time, after which it is expelled out through the urethra. So in this case, if you look at the urine, we see that mainly urine is mainly 95% made up of water, followed by 2.5% of urea, which is a metabolic nitrogenous waste that we expel, along with other salts, right? So we see that this is a quick summary of how excretion takes place and what are the different components of the excretory system. Now, of course, if you see, one form of waste that we just discussed about was urea, right? And urea is expelled out of our body through urine. But apart from that, if you also see, sweating is another way in which we get rid of excess water and salts as well. So especially during summers, if you see, we tend to sweat a lot, and that is a mechanism through which we get rid of, let's say, excess salt and water from our body. And that is one mechanism that we observe apart from, let's say, through getting rid of all of this through urine. Now, it is not just that we do this process of excretion. Various organisms resort to getting rid of these waste chemicals from their body depending on the availability of water. So, this right here is a very important factor. So, if you look at it, organisms which are found underwater, like fishes, they get rid of their nitrogenous metabolic waste in the form of ammonia, because ammonia is easily dissolvable in water, right? While on the other hand, if you look at our case, we expel it in the form of urea. While in the case of birds or in the case of lizards, it is through uric acid. So different organisms have different ways through which they get rid of their excretory product. Now, the last thing that we are going to be discussing is going to be dialysis. Now, in some cases, in some people, we observe that the kidneys may not work properly. And if the kidneys don't work properly, then it results in a condition where there is accumulation of toxic substances. And this can be harmful and in some cases fatal. Which is why for such people, we recommend a process called as dialysis, which is a medical process of getting rid of these toxic substances artificially. And we see that here we have a dialyzing machine, or what we call as an artificial kidney, where all the blood from the body which has these toxic substances or the metabolic waste is then brought out of the body, sent into this dialyzing machine, filtered out, and then sent back. So this is what we call as a artificial kidney. So with this, we've understood about transport of substances within our body and how our body transports the important substances to different parts and how it gets rid of waste. But what about in the case of plants? How do you think transportation takes place in plants? Is there a need for transport? Of course, there is a need for transport in plants as well, because we know that there is a need for transport of water from the roots to the upper parts for the process of photosynthesis to take place. Then we also know that there is a need for transport of food materials to different parts of the plant. And this is carried out by two tubular structures called as xylem and phloem. Now, xylem and phloem together form the vascular bundles that are responsible for transporting different substances. So first up, let's have a look at xylem. Now, xylem right here is primarily responsible for the transport of water and minerals from the roots to the upper parts of the plant, mainly the leaves, right? So in this particular case, xylem is mainly made up of dead tissue, and we see that transport through xylem is unidirectional. That means that transport can happen only in one way. It will take it from the lower parts all the way to the upper parts. Now, in taller plants, we see that there is another mechanism involved, which is called as transpirational pull. Now, what is transpiration? So, quickly to recall, we know transpiration is nothing but the loss of water in the form of water vapor from the aerial parts of the plant. Now, when water is lost in the form of water vapor, we see that it creates a suction pull. And when it creates this suction pull, we see that it's kind of like drinking water with the help of a straw, right? When you do, what do we observe? We see that a suction pull is created by which the water is then transported in the upper direction, right? So in the case of tall plants or tall trees, we see that this suction pull plays a very important role in helping in the transport through xylem. And apart from that, transpiration is also very essential because it helps in cooling of the plant. Next up, we have phloem. Now, in the case of phloem, we see that phloem is primarily responsible for transport of food materials to both upper parts as well as lower parts, because, hey, all parts of the plant need food in order to produce energy. Now, in this case, we see that transport in phloem is bidirectional, which means that it can be transported in both directions. So normally in your exam, they can ask you to differentiate between xylem and phloem for two marks, or sometimes they can ask you for 3 marks as well. And in such cases, you can elaborate the structure and function. So with this, everybody, we come to the end of this particular chapter. Now, mind you, this chapter is quite a big chapter, so please make sure you dedicate enough time to study it in great detail. So here's a quick homework question for all of you, where in the comments I want you to tell me what is the difference between xylem and phloem. Let me know in the comments, and of course don't forget to solve the questions which is available on the Google form. So thank you so much everybody for staying with us till the very end. You know BYJU'S 6th, 7th, 8th has always got you covered, and we are your ultimate exam prep partner. If you like what we do not forget to hit the like button on this video, and do not forget to share this video with all of your friends. Hoping to see you all very soon again. Take care, lots of love, and bye-bye.